Hi, it's Simon here from SDL Photography with another quick tutorial. This time we're going to be looking at adjusting the exposure in Lightroom. I've got three photos here, all taken just at the same time, just one after the other on bracketed exposures using my Canon 7D, and just setting it on auto exposure so that it would just adjust the shutter speed to compensate for the different exposure values that I wanted to get. So we've got what the camera took as its 0 exposure. We have a +2 exposure and a -2 exposure. So we're going to look at the value of the different exposures, and we'll quickly have a look about exposing to the right. That's an in-camera technique to make it much brighter, and then bring the exposure back down to a normal looking photo. You might look at this one and go, this is the one I want to do, and you're going, this one just is too bright to be able to use. But you'll see that just in a little while that this exposure may be actually the better one to actually use in the long run. But let's just jump into how we adjust exposure, and we're just going to go up to the develop module and come in there, and you'll see that once we have a look at the exposure, you'll see you've got your histogram up here showing you the relative values from the darkest point here all the way through to the brightest point. And you'll see as we move across them, you've got the blacks, you've got the shadows, you've got the exposure section, and these all correspond to exposure, blacks, shadows, whites and highlights. So if you come up here, you've got the blacks, you've got the shadows, you've got the exposure section, you've got the highlights, and you've got the whites. The aim is to get the exposure set correctly so that the histogram comes across and takes up most of the area and coming into a middle area. Then you want to adjust your highlights and your shadows so that it pushes out as much as it can to take up as much of this histogram space to get as dark as you can and as wide as you can across there, getting that full range of exposure. And then you actually bring the blacks back and you bring the whites back so that you're not clipping off anything. So we're just going to jump in and expose, and you can actually you can use the exposure slider here, so you can click on the exposure and make it brighter, and you can make it darker. So and if you ever want to reset any of these sliders, just double click on it and it'll bring it back to 0. You can also come up into this histogram and actually do the manipulation up here as well. So if we click in the exposure section, and it says it just down here, as you put your mouse over it, it says what it is. So over the exposure, we click and we drag right, and you'll brighten up the exposure. And so if we do that, or you drag it back down, you can darken it up. Same thing, double click brings it back. So what we're going to do is now actually do our adjustment. So we're going to bring it up, and just looking at this, about there, looks pretty good. And we're going to now look at our highlights, and you'll see it comes in order on the way you do it as you go down. Now adjusting the contrast will stretch it out, stretch the histogram left to right and push the values further wide. So we're just going to leave that alone for the moment, and we're going to adjust our highlights now. Now the interesting thing is you push it up, you'll see you're pushing it up, and you can actually see it's adjusting up into here. If we hold the option key down when we do this adjustment, you'll see you'll get a mask, and you can push it up and it'll show you where it's going to clip. You can start to see in there that it's getting to the point of clipping in these values here and just around here. And same with the shadows. If we were to push it all the way down, hold the option key, and we're just going to push the shadows further, and we're going to see that we're really not clipping too much in there. But I think they're just too much. I think we've pushed it out a little too much, and we're just going to bring those back anyway. So with whites, what you're wanting to do, and you can hold the option key down, so if we've got that all the way up and we've got a little bit of clipping, whites, you can actually see that you just want to pull it back down a little bit. And so you're pushing the highlights up as hard as you can and then you pull the whites back down so they're within the value, and you'll see you'll get these really bright intense whites coming out. So here, so if we were to just quickly show what I mean, so if we actually set this exposure even higher and pushed it up even higher up here, and we now reset the highlights, you're going to see that you're getting more and more of that coming there. So when we come down to the whites and we want to pull it back down, that's how you go about it. So you push it up and then you pull it back down. Now this is too much, so we just want to bring that back down to 1. And so I'm just doing this visually here. We're just going to stretch out some of the shadows, bring some of those back in. Okay, so that's that one set. Looks nice and bright, nice and clear. Okay, very good. So let's just jump over to our much brighter exposure, which is a +2 exposure from the camera. And if we look at the histogram over here, we see that the histogram, everything is being pushed to the right of the histogram. So they're very bright values up here. And to the point where we really haven't, we've got a little bit of clipping just up here. If we want to, you can actually, no, it's very close, not really clipped in there. So that's pretty good. This is what you'd classify as an exposed to the right photo. So we've pushed our photo to being very bright values, exposing it to the right, pushing the histogram to the right to the point where it's there, but it's not pushing over. You're not getting a big value up here, which is clipping all of the values. You've got it so bright that you don't have any more information in there. So instead of exposing, and we're going to adjust the exposure and we're going to bring it down this time. So you can hold the option key down. You can see you've got a little bit of clipping there. So we're going to bring the exposure down to -1. So it's relatively about the same as our previous photo. And then we're going to just work on our highlights, and you can see that our clipping symbol's just starting to show up there in the histogram, and we're getting a bit of clipping here. So we're going to just have it just up there. We're going to push it as hard as we can with the shadows. We can really push it down if we wanted to. So we're going to push it down there. And the whites, we're just going to bring that back so they're no longer clipping. And the blacks, we're just going to bring back into here. So you've got two photos that now look reasonably close to each other. Relatively, I mean, if we're looking at the sky and we're looking around the pool, they're all pretty much the same. But there is something about making a slightly darker photo brighter that doesn't give a good result, whereas making a brighter photo darker gives a better result. And that's why people really swear by exposing to the right. So we're just going to go up into our dark section here, this tree, and we're going to zoom in. So we're going to zoom in and we'll come in 2:1 in here, and we're just going to have a look up in there, and you can see this is our 0 exposure from the camera, and we've brightened up the dark areas. You can see that there's actually a bit of noise in here and noise in around the building. If we go to our +2 exposure and we have a look what it is in the tree there, and this is 2 times magnification, so the pixels are twice as big as they should be, you can see there isn't that level of noise. So we go from 1, you can see there's noise in the tree, back to no noise in the tree. So if you're adjusting exposed to the right photograph, you actually get a better result in the dark areas. And you've just got to make sure that you don't expose it so much that you get clipping in the highlights. This one's very good. It's got an incredibly intense blue within here, and it gives it such a deep richness to that. And I haven't played with any of the vibrancy or any of the saturation here, and it's full and intensive color at the moment. So exposing and pushing that up really high gives you and then bringing that exposure down gives you a much better result. Just to show you what I mean, if you're really pushing and you've taken a photo and there's a lot of latitude in raw files, you can move them around a lot. But if we were to try and actually get this exposure somewhere similar to what we've got with the other ones, and we pull it up and you can go, oh, look, I've got a kind of workable file that's looking similar to the other ones. We might just pull up our highlights a little bit more. You know, we're not clipping on any of those, so we can actually, because it's so dark, we can push it up really nice and high. With the shadows, we just need to be a little bit careful with that. We don't want to push it too much. So there we go. And the whites, we can bring it to about there. And the blacks, we can just bring it to about there. So if we were to come in and have a look at that now, and you can see this is 2 times the exposure here, it is very noisy. So the more you have to bring it up from the darker values and brighten it up, the more noise you're going to have, because you're duplicating a smaller amount of data that's actually available to the sensor. The darker areas has less light that's fallen onto it, so the values are lower. So when you duplicate it, which is multiplying it because you're trying to make it brighter, you actually increase the level of noise. So this is the 0 exposure here. You can see some noise, not as bad as in the -2 exposure, but when you come to the +2, you haven't got that noise in there. So this is a fantastic result out of using an exposed to the right photograph. So exposed to the right is when you take it in the camera a lot brighter, making it as bright as you can before it clips. So you're not getting any of the blowout of the highlights. This is Simon Lee for SDL Photography. I hope that you've learnt something and enjoyed this little tutorial on adjusting exposure in Lightroom.